All right. So my name is Sruchi. I'm the head of community engagement at Rickshaw Film Foundation.
And my name is Jay, and I'm one of the VPs at the Rickshaw Film Foundation.
And we're talking with the director and writer of It Lives Inside, Bishal Dutta, today. And we're so excited to hear about his process. And we're excited to hear about how he shares the movie with the world.
Thank you guys so much for having me on.
Bishal, just jumping right into it. I mean, first of all, congratulations on, South by Southwest premiere back in March, theatrical release in a couple of weeks. Huge congrats. I've told you before, but I'll tell you again. Just feel very, very proud. And so I'm so happy for you. And again, really happy that, Rickshaw can support in any way possible, but just want to give you your flowers in that way, first of all.
Thank you.
Second of all, let's just jump into it with our first question. So just, giving a brief overview of It Lives Inside, like what about the story excited you, especially a story that was both mythology and horror?
I think one of the biggest things for me coming into it was this idea of telling a story that I think felt personal to me and unique, and something I hadn't seen before, but doing it through this kind of common language that we all share. And I think that's horror, and that's what I love about the genre. And I think that there's a universality to it that really drew me to that genre because I want to tell specific stories, but make them universal. I don't want to make personal stories that are inaccessible. And so using horror as a vessel felt like a way for everybody to understand, to be able to put these personal experiences I've had, my family's had, friends have had, to be able to put that in a common language that I felt like everybody could kind of understand. And I thought, what better, sort of central event to ground the story in than kind of a friend breakup in high school, right? It feels now, I think with the space, with the distance, it feels so small, but those felt massive at the time. And it was it was a very intuitive process to then go, okay, there's this kind of friend breakup. One friend turns her back on the other friend as she's trying to fit in, and something bad happens. And what is that something? It's the unleashing of a demon.
So you kind of talked about like the scary stories that your family shared with you just now. What are some other scary stories that your family shared with you? Because I'm curious, when you heard these stories, did you imagine the Pisuch to look the way that it was represented in the film? Because I was talking to Jay earlier, and we were talking about how the way that it was represented, I was not expecting that, and it was such a cool way to see that monster. So like when you were kind of visualizing it and designing that, what was like the process behind it?
First, in terms of the story that kind of inspired the film, this was one I heard very young. It was my grandfather's story. He was born and raised in Assam, which is a northeastern part of India. And my grandfather tells the story that when he was a young man, he went to a family friend's house, and the family friend's daughter had a jar, like an empty jar that this little girl would talk to. And one day he told the little girl, there's nothing in the jar, right? And she got mad at him, and she opened the jar and she did this, like she threw something at him, but obviously nothing came out. And so my grandfather thinks nothing of it, and he goes home, and just the weirdest stuff starts happening to him. He starts hearing horses galloping in the middle of the night. He hears these strange noises that wake him up. There's knocking, and then he opens the door and there's nobody there. And the big one is one day he leaves some peanuts or some snack out, and he turns his back and he hears chewing, and then he turns around and the peanuts are gone or something, right? So my grandfather leaves. He's done with it. He's out of there. And that was the story that I heard growing up, that it made me wonder as I got older, like, okay, it's a very scary story, but let's imagine that it's true. What could that have been, right? That was really kind of the source of this movie. It's kind of where the movie started from, is to take something that felt like such a little fable, such a ghost story to tell around the campfire, but to treat it as if it were true. And what could that have been? And so that led me to the Pishash, which is, I think, a very significant cultural monster for us. And I picked that creature really because of the idea that it feeds on negativity. And I thought I had already figured out kind of the character of Sam and what she was going through. And the idea was, I think this is the perfect monster to kind of go up against this girl and what she's dealing with. It's going to directly feed on what she's dealing with. And so as we were designing the creature, Todd Masters designed the creature, who's a brilliant creature designer. And a lot of what we talked about is we looked at the cultural sort of images, right, that come from our text, and we talked about this is an artist's interpretation of this creature. What if we treated this creature as a purely, purely through physics, purely as a sort of animal that exists in our three dimensions, in our world? We wanted to treat it very realistically. And so that's a lot of where this creature came from. And the idea was really to imagine, thousands of years of hate and anger and negativity and put it in one creature. That was always the sort of basic mission of that creature design. And I think that what was really great was this sort of push and pull process of designing the creature, where it was about making it evil, and there's a very thin line. Like, I'll tell you, one of the early designs felt almost fish-like. The eyes were too far to the side, and it felt like it wasn't evil enough. It didn't feel intentional enough in its evil. So we were always directing it to that idea of the embodiment of hatred.
Wow. Oh my God. That's very cool.
Thank you.
Bishal, just going off of the kind of focusing on the mythology for a second, the mystery of It Lives Inside. It's never, really spelt out or explained. I think it was really clever how you were able to take with every character in the movie, like audience really felt everyone's kind of confusion throughout the course of the story. And so I thought you subverted the genre expectations really, really well, and especially for a story, that does involve mythology, that does involve, seemingly, hard to grasp concepts. Like I think you did that really, really well. But I'm curious more about, how did you plan and execute these subversions of expectations, like both in horror, and also if you want to talk about how you subvert those expectations for like a Dacey family, for example, you can speak to that too.
Certainly. I mean, working within horror, I think what's really wonderful about it is it comes with a certain sort of structure to it. Like, you understand the audience's expectation, and I think that the misinterpretation of that structure very often in the monster movie is that you give away the monster, you overexpose the monster too early, and you overexpose the mythology too early. But I think what an audience really wants is escalation, right? They want to understand that the film is taking them by the hand on a very sort of calculated ride, and there's always this escalation. That's what makes it a good roller coaster kind of film, right? So I think I wanted to take that kind of Jaws and Alien approach, where keep the thing in the shadows, keep the thing off frame, and find, sort of creative ways, right, to keep it to convey its presence, but not necessarily to show it off. So we were constantly trying to think of, oh, can we put a shower curtain in front of it? How frosted can the shower curtain be so we don't see it, but we see just enough? And I think that a big reason for that was, this is a movie about, to me, like the ultimate kind of boogeyman, right? This kind of childhood thing that shows up constantly in our minds, in our dreams. And I felt that for everybody watching the film, that they would be able to project their own sort of boogeyman into the film if we kept the creature hidden, right? And I think that through the main sequences of suspense and tension in the film, I think the subversion is really to give you just enough to understand that there's something there, but then to let your mind do the heavy lifting, and to go, for most of the movie, that you're projecting your own personal kind of monster in the closet into it, right? And in terms of subverting the daciness of it all, I think a lot of it came from really wanting to treat the characters as kind of naturalistically as sort of possible, and never essentially explaining their behavior or the customs, but letting the audience kind of learn through osmosis, letting, having a very much an observational camera live inside these spaces. And there are certain choices, like, the parents speaking Hindi at home. I think it's one of the things that always bugs me a little bit when I see films about our people, and I certainly grew up in a home where we spoke our language, right? And that sort of dichotomy of language, those are little things that I felt like I was able to, in a very documentarian sense, convey what it's like to live in our families and in our homes, without necessarily having to stop for an audience and say, well, this is why this thing happens, this is why this works. And I do think that kind of immersive experience for an audience, it really does help. It really does pull the audience into the film in a really big way. So I think that's something I was really empowered by my partners at QC and Neon on, just to say, let's present as opposed to explaining.
Amazing, thank you.
Yes, I really appreciated the like realness of it all. I was telling Jay earlier too that like my mom like believes in superstitions and she really like projects that, and so like seeing the mom like also kind of even in the beginning like don't whistle, like I was relating to so much of that. But I guess okay, so moving on to another question. Some of your closest collaborators worked on this film. What was it like working with your DP, Matthew Lin, to craft some of the most terrifying shots, and what films inspired some of the shots that we see? My one of my favorite shots was like when we see the characters like floating through like the hallways or whatever it may be. Like that was such a cool shot. So yeah, just kind of talking about your collaboration process.
Well, if I talked about everybody that I stole from, we'd be here all day. But I love movies. I love kind of repurposing things I've seen in other movies. Matt's the same. He has an incredible knowledge of film, and I recommend every filmmaker find this kind of partnership that Matt and I have, because it's one of trust that becomes intuition, if you will. I think everything's faster for us because we understand the sort of common language that we speak. And so if we're talking about a specific lens, we're both thinking about, okay, well, the 65 does this, the 100 does this, the 32 does this, because all of these are tools for storytelling. And when you work together as long as Matt and I have, there's a shared kind of understanding of how we want to tell stories. And so a couple of the key sort of tenets of this film were, first of all, were saturation and contrast. I really did not want to make a film that felt kind of drab or dry or too hard to see. I feel that horror works best when there's a sort of visual immersion to it that comes from that contrast and that punchiness. And I think it's also specific to our culture as well. You look at so many of our traditions are steeped in color, right? And specific colors, reds and golds. And so I think the idea was to take those sort of essential colors and seep them into the film in every sort of situation, right? And then in terms of creating imagery, I think there was a desire to harness what was so great about that kind of Amblin widescreen look, right? We talked a lot about films like Poltergeist, which is one of my favorite anamorphic 239 movies, and thinking about how do we evolve that look? How do we, kind of make it a little more modern? We worked in these very sort of tight and confrontational close-ups that Jonathan Demme used a lot, for example, and then you see Paul Thomas Anderson use. I was very inspired by how Barry Jenkins used them in Moonlight and Beale Street. And so there was really a kind of melting pot of ideas, both from this kind of mainstream past, these kind of classics of the genre, and from a little more the art house side. And so as we were developing this look, it was really, again, the duality of the film in both being kind of a very personal story, a very personal dramatic story, and this kind of large scale horror film. I think we were balancing that within the look of the film as well.
Kind of stepping shifting gears just a little bit more to character. So we have Samida, who's played by Megan Suri, and Tamira, who's played by Mohana Krishnan. Bishal, you mentioned that this is a story about a friend breakup of some capacity, estranged best friends, correct? And so their relationship is very special in this film, but you do it in a little bit of an unconventional way because you can feel their bond throughout the film, but it's not necessarily, you don't see them together all the time, right? And so talk a little bit more about that relationship and the importance of that relationship among those characters.
Absolutely. I mean, what was so interesting about writing the film, really the challenge was that you're absolutely right. I mean, Mohana's character, Tamira, really serves as the emotional stakes of the film, right? More than Sam dying or any of these specific outcomes, it's a race to save Tamira, right? And at the same time, you have to tell the story in a way, or I felt as though we have to tell the story in a way where that the closeness of their bond is a mystery for so much of it. And I think that it has to be a mystery because even though we're in Sam's mind, that she herself is pushing that kind of memory away, right? And so there are moments where it breaks through, where Jack Price, the editor, and I came up with little flashes that we could do as if like that relationship is puncturing through reality and she can't ignore it. But in the writing of it, it was really about planting those little seeds. And there are a couple of sort of tentpole moments, I would say. There's the confrontation in the locker room, for example, which is, I think, one of my favorite scenes in the film because of the performances that these two young actresses brought to the table. Because I felt that the audience would get it if the performances conveyed the subtext, that we would understand that there was a deeper pull between these two. They're not just strangers, they're not just people in two girls in math class or whatever, but there's something deeper that pulls them together. And I trusted the actors to really bring that to the screen, and I really think they did. And this is why I love actors. There's so much that I can write on the page, but then I watch them perform it, and I want to take all the dialogue out because they're just projecting so much truth just through their being, right? And so it was certainly a risk, Jay, and I hear you on that. But I think I just am so gratified that the actors pulled through and conveyed so much subtext with their looks and with the ways they carried each other.
They crushed it. They absolutely crushed it.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Um, all right. So this is kind of just a question about this was like your first feature film, and I feel like I was talking to Jay about this earlier. I feel like a lot of times when filmmakers have like diverse stories with diverse characters, they're oftentimes asked about like representation, and like that can be like a really overwhelming question. So I wanted to ask you, because you did such a great job of balancing the culture and like the story. But what's a question that you wish you could be asked about the film, but no one asks?
Oh man, that is the best question, isn't it? Let me think about it. I mean, the one thing I love talking about with this particular film, and really all of filmmaking, is sound specifically. And I think it's one of my favorite parts of the filmmaking process, and it's one of the things I'm proudest of on this film. If I can answer that question, is really with the sound of this film. That to me does so much of the heavy lifting of the storytelling. And I think that so few filmmakers are really accessing it the way that the absolute greats are. And it's one of my goals as a filmmaker to really harness sound as the storytelling tool that it can be. But in this one, it was all about perspective and point of view. And all of the camera decisions really come from that as well, right? First and foremost, you're thinking about who is the scene about, what are they going through, where's the camera sitting physically in the space of the location in relation to the actors. But then once you have that all together in the edit, I just love finding these kinds of sonic touches that push us deeper into the reality of the character. I mean, as we were doing the sound mix, for example, I had incredible mixers at Sharp Sound who did this up in Vancouver, and we were talking so much about where is Sam sitting in each scene, where is she standing in each scene, and how can we create, especially for the more sort of suspenseful, psychologically horrifying scenes, how can we create this feeling for the audience and for Sam that really there's something coming from here and there and back here, and create that very dynamic experience where we're looking around and wondering, is the creature right behind us, right? So those are the kinds of things I think you can accomplish with sound. And I think that there's really once you do a pass where the sound feels objectively correct, right? That this is what it would physically sound like with a microphone in the room, then you can really start getting to what does the moment feel like? And you can convey that with sound. You can take things out. You can drop things underwater a little bit. You can make something really loud that shouldn't be loud at all. So really, like, it's a part of the process that I don't think is talked about enough. And I'm so glad you gave me the opportunity to talk about it a little, because I love talking about sound.
And
Oh my
then,
gosh. Oh yeah. Go ahead,
no, no,
Jay.
go ahead, go ahead.
Or I think we're about to say the same thing, but Jay and I literally were like, we were like fanning out about the sound, and we were like, we got to figure out a way to ask him about that. But then
Amazing.
you answered it, so it was perfect.
Listen,
But yeah,
with this film, go watch it in theaters because
yeah.
Neon made us watch it alone through a screener, and it's terrifying alone. So
Amazing.
go
Yeah,
to
I'm
the
so excited
watch
to
the
watch
film.
it in the theater with the sound coming out
Yeah.
from all the speakers.
Amazing.
One of the last questions before we get into the more quick fire questions,
Yeah.
Bishal, is there's a very specific line that I still am thinking about, and it surely must be by design, but it's I'm going to tell you something and I need you to believe me. Tamira says it to Sam, Samida, and Samida then says it to her teacher, Joyce, who's
Mhm.
played by Betty Gabriel.
Right.
Um, that feels, and in the film, it felt like, I mean, those were pivotal moments of the film, right? It kind of
Absolutely.
felt like that was a little bit of like a thematic statement, that line.
I'm so glad you pointed out that line because absolutely it was one of the first kind of lines, and it's not a particularly showy line or something that you're going to put on a t-shirt or something, but it does to me kind of encapsulate what the film is about. And beyond the level of demons and curses and whatever, that there is this feeling that you won't be believed when you're going through something, and that the best thing someone can do for you is to believe you. And part of what the film was about, I think, for me, and I think weirdly enough, what every film that I make is going to be about, it's just something I keep getting drawn to, is ordinary people experiencing extraordinary things and then trying to come down from that mountain and tell everybody else about what they've experienced. And the push and pull of some people, kind of react with this blind faith, and some people push it away and say this isn't real. And so in a sense, I feel that believing someone is kind of the ultimate act of love. And it really felt like starting off with Tamira in that situation, saying that to Sam, Sam denying that to her, and then Sam going around and having to say that to her teacher and not being denied. It to me felt like such a clean way to construct a character arc for this person, and for her to experience what she had denied Tamira, but then for herself to get the acceptance, to get that belief that she's been craving.
Hmm. If that were on a t-shirt, I'd buy it. I think let's just jump into some of the quick fire questions.
What was it like working with Megan Suri?
Megan Suri is an absolute superstar. She brings so much intuition to the role, and she is incredibly versatile, both on the physical acting side and what the emotion that she can bring to any scene.
What were three inspirations for this film?
Three inspirations for this film were, first, I would say The Nightmare on Elm Street, the original 1984 film, huge one for me. At the same time, something like Poltergeist, which was really that kind of far edge of the Amblin kind of phenomenon. And third, I would say the original Conjuring, because I saw that when I was 16 and kids were daring each other to go see it. And it was so scary for me in a movie theater. And I really wanted to create that kind of communal horror experience for a new generation.
Describe the movie It Lives Inside in three words.
Describe It Lives Inside as scary, emotional, and resonant.
What's your favorite non-horror movie of all time?
My favorite non-horror movie of all time is probably Cameron Crowe's Almost Famous.
What's one piece of filmmaking advice you want to share?
A piece of filmmaking advice I'd like to share is that there, let me start that one again. A piece of filmmaking advice I'd like to share is that there's no such thing as a filmmaker who does one thing. A filmmaker really has to love and be passionate about every component of the filmmaking process, whether it's the image of the film, whether it's the sound of the film, whether it's the acting. So I think you just got to love all of cinema to make cinema.
And then I have one last question, and this has nothing to do with quick fire, but Bishal, because I know you've taught a class before. So if you lived in the world of It Lives Inside and you knew that all this horrific, scary craziness was going on at Samida's high school, would you teach there?
If I lived in the world of It Lives Inside, I would run. I would get out of there. I'd go somewhere completely on the other side of the country. I'm out of there so fast.